In this video, I'm going to show you how I attached my new Wolverine grinding system to my Ryobi 6-inch bench grinder. I needed a new grinding system because I got a bunch of new lathe tools recently, as you may have noticed, and I needed a good way to sharpen them. So everything that I'd heard, this Wolverine system is exactly the way to do that. So I'm not going to show you how to use the grinding system. I'm just going to show you how I set it up with my Ryobi grinder and some of the things I learned along the way of doing this. So let's get started. Hey, I'm Dave, and welcome to my garage. Now, the first step I had to do was find a location for it. So I found an open spot on this table where my old drill press used to be, and I figured it would be a great spot to do it. Now, the next thing we have to do is we need to take the rubber feet off of the bottom of the grinder. And that's relatively easy to do. Just two screws, you pop this base plate off and the rubber feet just pop off, and then you just stick the base plate back on and screw it back in. Now, after doing that, we come to find out that this grinder is only 4 inches from the center of the wheel to the base. Now, that's not going to work for the Wolverine system, which requires it to be about 6¼ to 6½ inches. So I went through and I grabbed some spare scraps that I had laying around, a couple of 2x4s and a couple of pieces of ply. Now I end up cutting those down to being 6 inches by 6½ inches, and that will create the base that we're going to use to mount the grinder on in order to put the Wolverine system under it. Now that I've got the pieces for the base cut off my crosscut sled, now I've got my 1/2 inch piece of ply, a couple of 2x4s, and another 1/2 inch piece of ply. That brings the center of this wheel up to 6½ inches. The recommendation from the instructions is 6¼ to 6½. Now what I'm going to need to do is I need to do the rest of the centering, which means I have to get this plate 1/2 inch from the edge of my surface, and I have to get the mounting bracket here. This little portion of the diamond needs to be perfectly centered underneath each of these grinding wheels. So now I need to find centers on those, then get them transferred down to the table, and then I can start placing these in their locations. And then once I have them in their locations, I can get everything bolted down and we can proceed to the next step. At this point, all I did was grab a little bit of wood glue and my Ryobi brad nailer and just gluing these pieces together and tacking them down so that they stay attached to the table. I'm not really worried about later on, because later on I'll just take the bench top off and disconnect it all if I ever need to replace it. So I just wanted to secure the base so that this grinder doesn't move when I go to use it later on. Now that we have the base plate secured to the table, I'm just going to use a square to square it up to make sure that it's in the right place and that the grinder is good, and we'll just bolt it down with a couple of wood screws. Now that the grinder is attached to this base that we made, we can get the Wolverine bases and center them up in the lines that we had drawn before and get them ready to be attached to the table. Now those watching may notice that I actually have screwed this up and I've got them reversed and they're in the wrong side. So after putting this in, I will immediately take all of it back apart, swap the bases, and put them back on in the correct order. Here's where I learned that I put the bases on the wrong side, so I've taken it off and put it back in the right place, and now we're going to center it and put it back in. A lesson that I learned on this was that I should have gotten a much larger extension for the impact, because the impact kept getting caught up on the grinding wheel trying to put the screws into the base plates. So make sure, if you do this, make sure you get a long enough extension to get past the grinding wheels. And here's where we find out planning ahead is always better off. When I put the base plate on, the handle was behind my belt sander, so I couldn't actually use it. So I needed to take it apart, swing the handle around to the front, and then put the base plate back on. Now that the bases are completely attached to the table and good to go, I can now assemble the last two pieces of the Wolverine Grinding System. On the coarse side of the left part of the grinder, I'm going to attach the platform, and then on the right side I will install the V-arm, which will be used for grinding chisels and my lathe tools. Well, there you have it. I have attached the Wolverine Grinding System to my Ryobi grinder. Now, I haven't used it yet, so I actually don't know how this is supposed to be used properly, but I do have a feeling I'm going to have to take these off because I think they're going to get in the way. They're the attachments for the original grinding shelf here. So without this, with these new plates, I think this is going to get in the way because I don't know if I'll be able to get this close enough to actually do any good. So we'll find out once I actually do it, but this is how I mounted my Wolverine Grinding System. Next up, I get to figure out how to use it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, mark like, subscribe, leave comments. You know what to do.